The Whispering Wards. Part 1. The Hum of the Void. Chapter 1. The first thing you learn on the night shift is that silence isn't silent. It's a symphony of subtle noises you'd never notice in the daylight cacophony. The hum of the ballast in the fluorescent lights, a low-frequency thrum that sinks into your bones. The rhythmic sigh and click of a ventilator down the hall, a mechanical ghost breathing for someone who can't. The distant, lonely clang of an elevator arriving at an empty floor. My name is Alex, and I was a connoisseur of these sounds. A newly minted registered nurse swimming in student debt and grief, I'd taken the night shift position at Blackwood Regional Medical Center for the pay differential and the solitude. Or so I told myself. The truth was, I couldn't stand the daytime bustle of hospitals anymore. Not after my mother. The well-meaning visitors, the chirpy volunteers, the doctors making their grand, self-important rounds, it all felt like a mockery of the grim reality humming just beneath the surface. At night, the pretense was stripped away. At night, a hospital was honest. It was a place where people slept, or suffered, or died. And the building itself seemed to hold its breath in witness. Blackwood was old. Not charmingly old, but decrepitly so. A brick behemoth from the 1950s, it had been added to and renovated in a piecemeal fashion over the decades, creating a confusing labyrinth of corridors. My domain was the third floor, West Wing, cardiothoracic step-down. A place for hearts on the mend and lungs struggling for air. It was a long, L-shaped ward with a central nursing station that offered a commanding, if unsettling, view of both corridors under the stark, buzzing lights. My preceptor for the first few weeks was Brenda, a woman who seemed as old and worn as the hospital itself. She was built like a retired stevedore, with a face mapped by decades of frowns and a voice that was equal parts gravel and cigarette smoke. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of 30 years on her feet, never wasting a step, never making a sound she didn't intend to. "Rule number 1, kid," she rasped on my first night, not looking up from her charting. "The machines lie. Trust your gut." She tapped her temple. "And this. The patient will tell you they're going south long before the monitor does. You just have to learn to listen." "Rule number 2, she continued, finally leveling her pale, tired eyes at me. "Don't go looking for trouble. This place is full of it, sleeping behind closed doors. You wake it up, you deal with the consequences." I nodded, assuming she meant difficult patients or the occasional sundowning dementia case. I was wrong. My first few weeks were a blur of routine. Med passes at 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., rounding every 2 hours, the squeak of my new Danskos, a comforting rhythm on the polished linoleum. Charting, and more charting. The quiet was broken only by the occasional call bell, usually for pain medication or help to the bathroom. I got to know my patients as sleeping shapes under thin blankets, their histories reduced to a few lines in a digital chart. Mr. Henderson in 304, post-triple bypass, a chronic snorer. Mrs. Gable in 310, end-stage COPD. Her breathing was a constant, wet rattle. The strangeness started subtly. So subtly, I dismissed it as fatigue, as my mind playing tricks on me in the liminal hours before dawn when the world feels thin and unreal. It was the call bell for room 313. The first time it happened, I was catching up on charting around 3 a.m. The light above the door to the west corridor blinked on, accompanied by the soft, insistent ding. I glanced at the board. Room 313. I frowned. Room 313 was empty. It had been for the entire time I'd been there. Brenda used it for storing extra IV poles and a broken-down Hoyer lift. I stood up and walked over, my footsteps echoing in the hallway. The light was definitely on. I pushed the door open. The room was dark and smelled of dust and stale air. The bed was stripped, the mattress covered in a crinkly plastic sheath. The call bell cord was coiled neatly on the bedside table, untouched. Chalking it up to a short in the ancient wiring, I went back to the nurse's station and canceled the call. Brenda was returning from a break, a styrofoam cup of coffee in hand. "Everything all right?" she asked. Yeah, 313's call light went off. Faulty wiring, I guess." Brenda's expression didn't change, but she held my gaze for a fraction of a second too long. "Yeah, it does that sometimes," she said, her voice flat. She offered no other explanation, and I didn't press. The night shift had its own culture, its own unspoken rules. Prying wasn't one of them. A week later, it happened again. This time, I was in the middle of a med pass. I heard the ding and saw the light. I was closer this time, just outside room 310. I walked the few steps and pushed open the door to room 313. Everything was as it was before, dark, still, empty. But this time, there was something else, a cold spot. Just inside the doorway, the air was suddenly unnaturally frigid, as if someone had left a freezer door open. I took a step back into the hallway, and the air was warm again. I stepped back in. Cold. My skin prickled. I reached in, my hand fumbling along the wall until I found the light switch. The room flooded with the sickly yellow glow of a single incandescent bulb. The empty bed, the dusty nightstand, the hulking shape of the broken lift in the corner. Nothing. The cold spot was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my heart beating a little faster. "It's just a draft," I told myself. "This old hospital is full of them." But there were no windows in this part of the hall, no air vents directly overhead. It made no sense. I went back to the nurse's station feeling a new kind of unease. I looked up the history of room 313 in the hospital's archaic record system. The digital records only go back 10 years. Before that, everything was on microfiche in the basement archives, a place Sal the security guard called the tomb. In the last decade, the room had seen a steady rotation of patients, no more or less remarkable than any other room on the floor. No unusual number of deaths, no strange incidents noted. The last patient had been discharged 2 months ago. The third time it happened was the night I knew something was wrong. It was a quiet Tuesday. All my patients were stable, Brenda was on vacation, and I was working with a float nurse named Maria, a cheerful young woman who spent most of the night scrolling through her phone. Around 2:25 a.m., the call light for room 313 went off. "I'll get it," I said, mostly to myself. Maria barely looked up. I walked down the west corridor, the silence pressing in on me. The light above the door pulsed like a weak heartbeat. I didn't bother opening the door this time. I knew what I'd find. I reached for the intercom panel on the wall next to the doorframe. "This is the nurse's station," I said, my voice sounding loud in the quiet. I waited for the static of an empty channel. Instead, a sound came through the small speaker. A faint, dry scraping sound, like fingernails on wood, or like whispering. A long, drawn-out, sibilant sound, like the tail end of a word spoken in a breathy rush. "Sssss." My blood went cold. I leaned closer to the intercom. "Hello? Is someone in there?" The sound came again, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't just a hiss, it was a voice. Desiccated and ancient, but it was a voice. "Help me." The words were so faint, so threaded with static, I thought I might have imagined them, but I hadn't. I had heard them. I jabbed the talk button again, my thumb trembling. "Who is this? The room is supposed to be empty." Silence. Then a click, and the call light went out. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the door to room 313. The rational part of my brain, the part that aced anatomy and pharmacology, was screaming at me. It was radio interference. It was a crossed wire with another room's intercom. It was an auditory hallucination brought on by caffeine and sleep deprivation. But the other part of me, the part that held my mother's hand as she took her last, shuddering breath,
knew what it had heard. It was the sound of suffering, and it had come from an empty room. I backed away from the door slowly, never taking my eyes off it, as if expecting it to fly open. I returned to the nurse's station, my face pale. Maria finally looked up from her phone. "You okay, Alex? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a weak smile. "Just tired. Long night." But it wasn't just a long night. It was the beginning of them. I didn't know it then, but I had just answered a call I should have ignored. I had acknowledged the watcher in the dark, the silent resident of Blackwood's whispering wards. And it, in turn, had acknowledged me. Chapter 2. The encounter with the voice on the inner.
Chapter 3. Brenda's casual revelation about Old Man Hemlock's chair was a turning point. It dragged the strangeness out of the solitary confinement of my own mind and gave it a name, a history. It was no longer a question of if something was happening, but what. And Brenda was the gatekeeper of that knowledge. I decided to confront her directly. Catching her on her cigarette break became my new ritual. I'd stand there, breathing in the secondhand smoke and the cold night air, trying to pry open the clamshell of her 30 years of experience. "So, Hemlock," I started one night, trying to sound nonchalant. "What was his story?" Brenda blew a perfect smoke ring that dissipated in the darkness. "Just a guy. Lived a long, hard life. Lost his legs in a mill accident. Outlived his wife and kids. Had no one left. This place became his home. That room was his whole world at the end." "And the chair, it just moves on its own?" "Doesn't move," she corrected, fixing me with her steady gaze. "It appears. There's a difference. It's like a wrinkle in time, a picture of how things used to be, bleeding through to now. This whole building is full of them if you know where to look." This was my opening. "Like the call bell in 313? She took a slow drag, considering. "That's different," she said finally. "The chair, that's just a recording, an echo. The bell, that's someone trying to get your attention." A shiver traced its way down my spine. "Who?" Brenda crushed her cigarette under her heel. "When you've worked here as long as I have, you learn that when people die, they don't always leave. Not completely. Especially if they die scared or in pain or with something left unfinished. They leave a residue, an imprint of their strongest emotions. This hospital is soaked in it. Most of the time, it's just background noise. A cold spot here, a funny shadow there. But sometimes it gets focused, concentrated." She looked back at the looming brick facade of the hospital. "Room 313, it's always been a bad room, a heavy room. A lot of people have died in there, not just peacefully in their sleep. I'm talking ugly deaths, painful, frightening." My mind flashed back to the whisper on the intercom. "Help me." "So what's in there now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what exactly," she admitted. "It's been quiet for a long time, but it feels like something's stirring it up. And you, kid, asking questions, paying attention, you're like a lightning rod. You're noticing things, so things are noticing you." Her words chilled me more than any spectral wheelchair. The idea that my own perception was somehow attracting this phenomenon was deeply unsettling. The activity on the ward began to escalate, becoming more personal. It was no longer confined to room 313. One night, I was sitting at the nurse's station charting when I heard a soft tapping sound. I looked up. It was coming from the glass partition that separated the station from the corridor. I expected to see Sal, the night security guard, on his rounds, but there was no one there. Tap, tap, tap. It was insistent. I stood up and walked to the glass, peering out into the empty hall. The tapping stopped. I pressed my ear to the cool surface. Silence. As I turned to go back to my seat, I saw it. A small, greasy handprint on the glass, right where the tapping had been. It was the print of a child's hand. My blood ran cold. There were no children on this floor. The pediatric ward was on the 5th floor, on the other side of the hospital, and it was locked down tight at night. I stared at the handprint, a perfect, ghostly image against the glass. It was so out of place, so impossibly there. I grabbed a sanitizing wipe, and with a shaking hand, I erased it. I told Brenda about it the next night. She just nodded slowly, her face grim. "The children's ward used to be here," she said quietly. "Back in the 60s, before they built the new tower, they had a polio outbreak. Lost a lot of kids on this floor, in this very wing." The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. The disembodied tapping, the small handprint, it was another echo, another piece of the hospital's tragic history bleeding through. The phenomenon began to target the patients. Mrs. Gable in 310, the frail woman with COPD, started having night terrors. I'd find her wide awake in the dead of night, her eyes huge with fear, staring at the corner of her room. "The shadow man," she'd rasp, her voice thin and reedy. "He's watching me. From the corner. He's so tall." I'd turn on the lights, show her the empty corner, soothe her with soft words and the promise of a mild sedative. But her fear was contagious. Every time I entered her room, I found myself glancing at that same corner, my skin crawling, half expecting to see a tall, dark shape resolve itself out of the shadows. Even the more lucid patients were affected. Mr. Henderson in 304, a no-nonsense former truck driver, buzzed me one night, his voice tight with panic. "There's someone in my bathroom," he whispered into the intercom. I rushed to his room. He was sitting bolt upright in bed, pointing a trembling finger at the closed bathroom door. I heard him. He was humming. I opened the bathroom door. The small room was empty, the light off. The air was still. "There's no one here, Mr. Henderson." "I swear to God, nurse," he insisted, his eyes wide. "I heard it, a little tune, like a nursery rhyme. It was right there." I didn't have the heart to tell him that his room was directly adjacent to the old polio ward. The incidents were becoming a nightly occurrence. A file cabinet in the charting room would slide open on its own. The scent of cloying, old-fashioned perfume would drift down the hall, then vanish. I started keeping a small black notebook, documenting everything in secret. The date, the time, the event. The pages filled with a chronology of the impossible. October 12th. 2:47 a.m. Call bell, 3:13. No voice. October 14th, 4:12 a.m. Wheelchair in hall. October 17th, 1:20 a.m. Child's handprint on glass. October 18th, 3 a.m. Mrs. Gable reports shadow man. October 19th, 2:14 a.m. Mr. Henderson reports humming. October 21st, 3:33 a.m. All the call lights on the West Wing panel lit up at once for exactly 10 seconds, then went out. I felt like I was losing my mind, but the notebook was my anchor. It was proof. The fear was constant, a low-grade fever that never broke. But something else was growing alongside it, a strange, obsessive curiosity. I wasn't just a victim of the haunting. I was becoming its chronicler. One night, Sal, the security guard, found me staring down the west corridor towards room 313. Sal was a large, comfortable man in his late 50s with a soft paunch and a kind face. He'd worked nights at Blackwood for 20 years and moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew there was no point in rushing toward whatever the night might hold. "Don't stare into the abyss, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It stares back." "I told Brenda about this place," I said. Sal nodded, his keys jangling softly at his hip. "Brenda's seen a thing or two. We all have, if we're being honest with ourselves. This building, it's got bad bones." He leaned against the wall, his gaze distant. "I used to hear them, you know? The kids, crying. Down this hall. Faintly. Haven't heard them in years, though. It's like something else, something bigger, moved in and scared them off." He looked at room 313. "That room there, that's the heart of it. The generator. I don't go down that end of the hall on my rounds anymore. Not unless I have to. The air gets thick, hard to breathe. Feels like walking through water."
His validation was a relief and a terror. I wasn't alone in this, but his fear, the fear of a man who had walked these halls for 2 decades, was palpable. "What do you think is in there, Sal?" He shook his head, pushing himself off the wall. "I don't know, and I don't want to. Some doors are best left closed." He continued on his rounds, his heavy footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving me alone with the humming lights and the oppressive silence. I looked at the closed door of room 313. Sal's words echoed in my mind. Some doors are best left closed. But I was beginning to fear that it was already too late. Something had been unlocked, and it was getting stronger every night.
Chapter 5. The escalation was no longer linear. It was exponential. The phenomena on the ward grew from unnerving to overtly hostile. It was as if my investigation, my acknowledgement of its existence, had fed it, giving it the strength to push back against the world of the living. One night, I was drawing up medications in the med room, a small windowless closet filled with vials and pill packets. The door, a heavy fire-rated slab of wood, was propped open with a rubber wedge. As I carefully measured a dose of heparin into a syringe, the door slammed shut with a deafening boom that shook the entire room. I jumped, dropping the syringe, which clattered to the floor. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The door was now firmly closed, the wedge kicked out into the hall. I was plunged into near darkness, the only light a dim sliver from under the door. "Very funny, Brenda," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. "Sal?" Only the hum of the medication refrigerator answered me. I took a deep breath and tried the handle. It wouldn't turn. It was as if someone was holding it from the other side. I rattled it, then started pounding on the door. "Hello? Somebody let me out!" I felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over me. The air in the small room suddenly felt thick and cold. I could hear something on the other side of the door. A scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly down the wood. Panic set in. I threw my shoulder against the door, again and again, shouting until my throat was raw. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, a sound of pure, patient menace. Just as I was about to give in to a full-blown panic attack, the handle turned with a loud click and the door swung open. Brenda stood there, her face etched with concern. "Alex, what the hell is going on? I heard you yelling from the break room." I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. "The door! It slammed shut! It was locked! Something was scratching!" Brenda looked at the heavy door, then at the empty hallway. "The lock on this door is broken, kid. It hasn't latched in years." She pushed it, and it swung freely on its hinges. "And I was at the other end of the hall. I didn't hear any scratching." I looked at her, wild-eyed. "I'm not crazy, Brenda. It happened." "I never said you were crazy," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I said this place is getting to you. It's testing you, pushing you. You need to push back." But how do you push back against something that can lock you in rooms and defy the laws of physics? The physical manifestations grew more alarming. One evening, as I was checking on Mr. Henderson, I noticed the crucifix he kept on his bedside table was hanging upside down. He was a devout Catholic, and I knew he would never have done that himself. I fixed it, my hand shaking, my mind reeling at the deliberate, blasphemous nature of the act. The electronics on the floor went haywire. Televisions would switch on in empty rooms, blasting static at full volume. The central monitoring station would flatline for a patient, sending me running to their room only to find them sleeping peacefully, their heart rhythm perfectly steady on their local monitor. They were phantom codes, designed, it seemed, to fray my nerves and exhaust me. Dr. Evans, the arrogant but sharp hospitalist, began to notice. After the third phantom code in a week, he pulled me aside. "What is going on with your floor, Alex?" he demanded, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "These false alarms are wasting valuable time. If you can't handle the telemetry system, maybe you're not cut out for this ward." I wanted to scream at him. "It's not the system, it's a ghost. A malevolent entity is trying to kill your patients." But I just mumbled an apology and promised to have engineering check the wiring again. His skepticism was just another wall isolating me. To him, I wasn't a haunted man. I was an incompetent nurse. The entity's focus, however, remained on room 313. But now it wasn't just a call bell. The room itself seemed to be changing. One night I walked past and noticed the door was slightly ajar. I never left it ajar. I pushed it open and switched on the light. The room was cold, as always, but there was a new smell, a cloying, metallic odor that reminded me of old blood and rust. In the center of the plastic-sheathed mattress was a dark, reddish-brown stain that hadn't been there before. It was about the size of a dinner plate, and it looked disturbingly like a fresh blood stain that had been hastily wiped away. I backed out of the room, my stomach churning, and pulled the door shut. I didn't document it. I didn't tell Brenda. Some things were too terrible to give voice to, as if speaking them would make them more real. My personal life had all but disintegrated. I stopped answering calls from friends. I was too tired, too paranoid. The whispers in my apartment had coalesced into a single, terrifying phrase, repeated over and over in a dry, rasping hiss. "Get out." It wasn't a warning. It was a command. And it was coming from inside my own head, as often as it was from the corners of my room. Was the entity telling me to get out of the hospital? Or was it my own fractured psyche begging for an escape? I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Desperate, I took a different approach to my research. I wasn't just looking for history, I was looking for a solution. I spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of paranormal investigation websites, forums on demonology, and articles on spiritual cleansing. The information was a wild mix of crackpot theories and ancient traditions, smudging with sage, lines of salt, holy water, exorcism rites. It all felt like grasping at straws, applying medieval superstition to a problem I barely understood. But I was desperate. I bought a bundle of sage online. One night, before my shift, I stood in my living room, a cheap ceramic bowl in my hand, feeling like a complete fool. I lit the sage, and the pungent, acrid smoke filled the small space. Waving the smoldering bundle, I walked from room to room, repeating the words I'd read online. "I cleanse this space of all negative energy. Any spirit or entity not of the light is not welcome here. You must leave." My voice sounded thin and ridiculous. As the smoke reached the darkest corner of my bedroom, the spot where the whispers always seemed to originate, the smoke detector shrieked to life. The piercing, electronic alarm was 1,000 times more jarring than any whisper. As I frantically waved a towel at the detector to shut it up, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Laughter. It was a low, guttural, mocking laugh, and it came from that dark corner. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was laughing at my pathetic attempt to fight back. The sage wasn't a weapon. It was a joke. I threw the smoldering sage stick into the sink and ran the water, my hands trembling. The laughter faded, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. It was toying with me. It was stronger than a smudge stick and a few hopeful words. It was an ancient, powerful thing, and I had made it laugh. I went to work that night a defeated man. The fear had curdled into a kind of grim resignation. I walked onto the ward, and the atmosphere was electric. Brenda met me at the station, her face pale. "It's bad tonight, Alex," she said, her voice low. It's active." She was right. The air was thick and heavy, charged with a static-like energy. The call lights flickered randomly like faulty Christmas lights. The central monitoring station would flatline for a patient, sending me running to their room only to find them sleeping peacefully, their heart rhythm perfectly steady on their local monitor. They were phantom codes, designed, it seemed, to fray my nerves and exhaust me. The climax came around 3:33 a.m., a time the paranormal forums called the witching hour. I was standing at the station when I saw it. The door to room 313, which I had firmly closed at the start of my shift, began to creak open, slowly, inch by inch. It swung inward, revealing a sliver of the profound darkness within. And from that darkness, something began to emerge. It wasn't the Shadow Man. It was worse. A shape, blacker than the darkness behind it, began to pull itself through the doorway. It was low to the ground, moving with a jerky, unusual motion, like a stop-motion creature from a nightmare. It was vaguely humanoid, but bent and twisted, its limbs at impossible angles. It had no face, just a smooth, dark plane of shadow where features should have been. It made a wet, dragging sound as it pulled itself across the linoleum, leaving a dark, glistening trail behind it. I was paralyzed, every muscle in my body locked in terror. This was it. The final veil between the worlds had been torn away, and the thing that lived on the other side was crawling into my reality. Its progress was agonizingly slow. The wet, dragging sound was the only noise in the universe. It was the sound of something broken, something that should not be able to move, yet did. As it slid under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I could see its form more clearly. It looked like a man, but a man that had been shattered and put...
Part 3. The Heart of the Matter. Chapter 7. The service elevator whined in protest as it descended into the hospital's guts. The air grew colder, mustier, thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. It was a journey into the past, into the building's subconscious. The bright, sterile facade of the upper floors was a lie. This was the truth of Blackwood. The elevator shuddered to a halt, the doors groaning open to reveal the sub-basement. Sal's flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the oppressive darkness. We were in a vast, low-ceilinged space cluttered with the ghosts of hospital equipment past. Rusted gurneys, defunct iron lungs that looked like medieval torture devices, stacks of bed frames. A thick layer of dust coated everything, a gray shroud over the forgotten. A network of massive pipes snaked across the ceiling, dripping rhythmically, the sound like a slow, steady water torture. "The records room is this way," Sal said, his voice a low, tight rumble. "Morgue is just beyond it." We moved through the maze of junk, our footsteps crunching on the gritty floor. The silence here was different from the silence on the ward. It was a dead silence, profound and absolute, as if sound itself had died down here. Every drip of water, every scuff of our shoes was an intrusion. The air grew perceptibly colder as we approached a heavy metal door with the words "Records Archive" stenciled on it in faded black paint. Sal fumbled with his keys, the jangling sound unnaturally loud. He found the right one and turned it in the lock. The click echoed in the vast space. The room was a crypt for paper. Rows upon rows of tall metal shelves stretched back into the darkness, crammed with cardboard boxes and thick leather-bound ledgers. The air was thick with the smell of brittle paper and time. "They stopped using this place in the late 90s when everything started going digital," Sal explained. "Finch's time, that would be in the personnel and patient files from the 60s, should be over here." Brenda and I followed him, our own smaller flashlight beams dancing nervously across the shelves. The sheer volume of history was overwhelming. Every box represented thousands of lives, thousands of stories of pain and healing, birth and death, all stored here in the dark. "We're looking for personnel files for Alistair Finch and patient files for Elias Finch," Brenda stated, her voice all business. It was a mask for her fear. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the doorway. We split up, each taking a row. The task was monumental. The boxes were labeled with dates, but the system was chaotic. We pulled down heavy, dust-choked boxes, our hands quickly covered in gray grime. We coughed in the dry, stale air. I was searching through a box labeled Patient Records 1961 A to G when I found it. The file was thin, the manila folder yellowed and brittle with age. The name on the tab was stark and clear. Finch, Elias. "I've got it," I whispered. My voice cracked. Brenda and Sal hurried over, their flashlight beams converging on the file in my hands. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The contents were sparse. Admission forms, basic vitals, a diagnosis of congestive heart failure. Elias Finch was 68 years old, a retired librarian with no living relatives, admitted to the terminal ward. Prognosis, poor. But tucked into the back of the file, separate from the official hospital forms, were several pages of handwritten notes on a different kind of paper. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and aggressive. The notes were meticulous, filled with medical jargon I barely understood, but the intent was horrifyingly clear. Subject's potassium levels artificially lowered to induce arrhythmia. Brenda read over my shoulder, her voice shaking with rage. 20 cc's of experimental beta blocker administered. Subject experienced temporary cardiac arrest, duration 47 seconds before successful resuscitation. Subject reports visions. I continued, my own voice a horrified whisper. Describes a tunnel of light, feelings of peace. Contamination. Must recalibrate dosage to bypass the euphoric response and access the liminal state directly. It was a diary of torture. Dr. Alistair Finch hadn't just been trying to cheat death. He had been using Elias as a guinea pig to map the afterlife, systematically killing and reviving him, documenting his trips across the Vale. The final entry was dated the night both men died. Massive dosage administered. Subject's response, violent. Unexpected bioelectrical feedback through monitoring equipment. Catastrophic. The rest of the page was a frantic, spidery scrawl, ending in a long, dark streak of ink where the pen had ripped through the paper. "My God," Sal breathed. He opened a door in that poor man's soul, and something came back through. It killed them both. "It didn't just kill Finch," Brenda said, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "It became him. It took his evil, his ego, and it merged with whatever chaos he unleashed, and it's been anchored here ever since by Elias's agony." The dripping from the pipes in the main room seemed to get louder, faster. A low humming sound started to emanate from the walls around us, a deep vibration that we could feel in our teeth. "It knows we're here," I said. "It knows we have the file." "We need to go," Sal urged, already backing towards the door. As we turned, a sound from the far end of the archive room made us all freeze. It was the sound of a heavy cardboard box sliding off a high shelf and crashing to the floor. Then another and another. Something was in the room with us, moving through the shelves at the back, coming our way. We didn't wait to see what it was. We fled the records room, slamming the heavy metal door behind us. We could hear the crashes getting closer, faster, a wave of destruction rolling through the archives. "The morgue," Brenda said, her voice tight. "The file says his body was taken to the morgue. His personal effects might still be there. There has to be something we can use, something to tether a blessing to." It was the thinnest of hopes, but it was all we had. Sal led the way, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The door to the morgue was at the end of a short tiled corridor. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees as we approached. Frost lined the edges of the metal door. Sal's hand trembled as he inserted the key. He pushed the door open, and we were hit with a wave of unnatural cold and the clean chemical smell of formaldehyde. The morgue was a sterile, stainless steel nightmare. A gleaming autopsy table sat in the center of the room under a harsh, surgical light. Along one wall was a bank of refrigerated body lockers. The humming was louder in here, seeming to come from the lockers themselves. One of the doors, labeled 3, was slightly ajar. "That's not right," Sal whispered. "These are vacuum sealed. They can't just pop open."
As we watched, the door to locker number 3 began to swing open, slowly, with a low groan of metal. A plume of freezing mist billowed out, swirling on the floor like a living thing. From the darkness within the locker, a hand emerged. It was pale, skeletal, and coated in a layer of frost. It gripped the edge of the sliding slab and with a terrible, slow strength began to pull itself out. We were frozen in a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The body that slid into view was not Elias Finch's. It was ancient and desiccated, a withered husk in a tattered hospital gown. But its eyes snapped open. They were milky white, blind, but they fixed at us with an impossible, hateful intelligence. It opened its mouth in a silent scream, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The very air seemed to crystallize. Then, from the other lockers, came a sound. Banging. One by one, the other locker doors began to shake and rattle as if the dead inside were waking up, pounding on the doors, demanding to be let out. "It's animating them," Brenda yelled over the din. "Finch is using them as puppets." The mummified body on the slab sat up, its head turning with a series of dry, cracking sounds. It opened its mouth again, and this time a voice came out. But it wasn't the voice of the corpse. It was a chorus of voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in a cacophony of pain and fear. It was the voices of every soul that had suffered on the 3rd floor. And above them all, one voice, cold and arrogant and full of mocking laughter. Finch's voice. "You think you can save him," the chorus of voices rasped. "He belongs to me. This whole hospital belongs to me. You are just meat, and you will join my collection." The banging on the lockers intensified, the metal doors beginning to buckle and warp. We were out of time. "His personal effects," Brenda screamed, pointing to a small cabinet on the far wall. "Alex, check it." While Brenda and Sal kept their flashlights trained on the rising corpse, I scrambled to the cabinet. It was unlocked. Inside were dozens of small brown bags, each with a name tag. I frantically searched through them. Miller, Sanchez, Peterson. Then I saw it. A bag with the name Finch Elias written in neat cursive.
Chapter 9. I woke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. My own. For a confused moment, I thought I was back on the 3rd floor, at the start of another long night. Then, the pain in my shoulder flared, sharp and real, and it all came flooding back. I opened my eyes. I was in a hospital room, but it wasn't at Blackwood. This room was bright, clean, and modern. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Well, look who decided to join the land of the living. I turned my head. Brenda was sitting in a chair by the window, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked exhausted, older, but she was smiling, a real smile. "Brenda?" My voice was a dry croak. "St. Catherine's General," she said, answering my unspoken question. "They brought us here after. What happened?" I asked, trying to sit up. A sharp pain in my shoulder made me wince. I looked down and saw my arm was in a sling. The official story is that there was a massive electrical surge at Blackwood, caused a cascade failure, blew out the main transformers, triggered a small fire in the basement. The building's been condemned. They're tearing it down. She took a sip of her coffee. "The EMTs found us in the lobby. You were unconscious, dislocated shoulder. I had a concussion. Sal just had a few bruises and the scare of his life. They said it looked like a bomb had gone off in there." "Finch?" I asked, my voice a whisper. Brenda's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound solemnity. "Gone," she said. "Whatever that thing was, you destroyed it. When the sun came up, the ice on the doors just
melted. The air, it was just air again. It felt clean. I looked at my hand, the one that had held the cross. It was empty. "The cross?" I said. "She said it was on the floor next to you, just a piece of charred wood. It crumbled to dust when I tried to pick it up. Whatever power it held, you used it all up." We sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable silence of survivors. "Elias Finch," I said. "He's at peace." "They all are," Brenda said softly. "All the souls trapped in that place. You freed them." Sal came in a few minutes later, carrying a bouquet of cheap gas station flowers. He looked shaken, but whole. He clapped my good shoulder, his eyes full of a gratitude that needed no words. "You know, when they were clearing out the sub-basement, they found that file, the one on Elias Finch. The investigators, they're calling it a cold case, reopening the investigation into Dr. Alastair Finch. His name won't be on any wings of the new hospital they're planning to build, I can tell you that." It was a small victory, a vindication of a man suffering 50 years too late, but it mattered. The truth, finally, had come to the light. My recovery took weeks. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological scars remained. I had nightmares. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of scratching or a sibilant whisper echoing in my ears. But they were just echoes now. The presence behind them was gone. Brenda retired. She said she'd had enough night shifts to last several lifetimes. She moved to Florida to be closer to her grandkids, but we talked on the phone every week. Sal took an early retirement package and bought a small fishing boat. And me? I didn't quit nursing. I couldn't. After facing the ultimate embodiment of pain and neglect, I felt my purpose more clearly than ever before. Compassion wasn't just a weakness for a demon to exploit. It was the most powerful force in the universe. It was a light in the darkness. I transferred to the day shift at St. Catherine's on the palliative care wing, a hospice ward. It was a place of profound sadness, but also of profound peace. My job was no longer just about administering meds and charting vitals. It was about holding hands. It was about listening. It was about being a witness, a comforting presence in the face of the inevitable. It was about making sure no one died alone, unheard, their pain leaving a stain on the world. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, as the sun begins to set and the shadows in the rooms grow long, I'll feel a familiar chill. I'll hear a sound I can't quite place, and for a fraction of a second, the old fear will try to find a foothold. But then I'll look at my patient, at the fragile, precious life in the bed before me. I'll smooth their blanket, or offer a sip of water, or just sit with them in the quiet. And in that simple act of caring, the darkness recedes. The first thing you learn on the night shift is that silence isn't silent. It's full of whispers. But I've learned something else since then. I've learned that the loudest thing in the universe isn't the shriek of a demon or the groan of a haunted building. It's the quiet, steady, and defiant beat of a human heart, refusing to be extinguished. And my job is to listen to it until the very end.